In this session, we will see what is AAA and how it helps device access control and network access control, why do we need it with examples, AAA questions and answers, basic AAA configuration, AAA method list, a comparison between device access control and network access control, a comparison between Radius and TACACS Plus, AAA configuration with servers, and AAA commands in detail. First of all, what is AAA? AAA is a set of features that provide authentication, authorization, and accounting. In plain terms, authentication consists of verifying the identity of whoever wants to get access to network resources, be it a human being, a device, an application, a script, and so on. Authorization consists on defining who is allowed to access what network resources. And accounting consists of tracking who and when used network resources. AAA provides the necessary features to provide device access control. Device access control means controlled access for users that want to use device resources. AAA also includes the necessary features to provide network access control. Network access control means controlled access for devices that want to use network resources. In this session, we are focusing on AAA for device access control. Now we are going to talk about why do we need AAA. And in order to illustrate that, we are going to show some examples that are going to make use of this set of entities that want to gain access to this device. These entities may be human beings, they may be PPP over Ethernet routers, they may be RESTconf applications, netconf scripts, and so on. Now, the first security need that we may have will be how to make sure that whoever or whatever wants to gain access to our device is who he or it claims to be. And in order to solve that, we have authentication login. With authentication login, we might ask remote entities for adequate credentials, such as a username and a password. With this feature, we are going to discard third parties or malicious users that want to gain access to our device. Notice that for remote devices, for instance, PPP over Ethernet devices that are also valid users, we're going to use a slightly different feature that is known as authentication PPP. After the authentication phase is over, now we have to face the following challenge. We need to have control over who can execute what. In that sense, we need to provide the adequate shell permissions to users according to how they are configured. So how do we control whether a user have access to an RBAC view, or maybe to privilege level number 1 or 15, or maybe a custom privilege level? In order to solve this, we're going to use a feature that is known as authorization exec. With authorization exec, we are going to take into account how the users are configured. So some users may start using an RBAC view. Some users may start using the adequate privilege levels that they were configured to use. If we don't use authorization exec, everybody is going to start at privilege level number 1, regardless of how the user is configured. An important note here, if the authorization exec feature is used and fails, then the user is going to get disconnected and no exec session is going to be granted. The next challenge that we may face is providing AAA servers with control over who can execute what. This means having some users being able to execute harmless commands and some other users being able to execute more impactful commands, and other users being able to actually enter global configuration mode. In order to achieve that, we are going to use the feature authorization commands. Remember that this feature makes more sense when using AAA servers. We want to provide AAA servers with this control over users. If we are not using AAA servers, this feature does not make too much sense because we already may configure that with privilege levels or RBAC views locally, and we will be set with the authorization exec feature for that matter. In the same manner, in order to provide AAA servers with the ability to control who can configure what, we are going to use the feature authorization config commands. In order to use this feature, we must have previously configured authorization commands. Remember that this feature makes more sense when using AAA servers, because if we are not using AAA servers, we are set with privilege levels, RBAC views, and the privilege exec feature. And what about the enable command? If someone executes the enable command and provides an enable password, who is the entity that is going to confirm that this password is actually correct? In order to solve this, we are going to use the authentication enable feature that is going to allow us, for instance, ask AAA servers whether this command is correct, or maybe rely on locally configured passwords to confirm this password. Notice that when using AAA servers uses a little trick in order to store enable passwords. Remember that enable passwords are not related to a particular users. So AAA servers are going to perform this trick. They are going to create this dummy user in order to store enable passwords. And remember that AAA is all about security. What if we wanted to create a registry each time someone starts an exec session? In order to solve that, we are going to use the accounting exec feature. So we may create a registry every time someone starts using an exec session, or when someone stops using an exec session, or maybe we want to create both registries. In the same manner, we may want to create a registry each time a user executes a command. And in order to do so, we are going to use the accounting command feature. We may have several questions so far, so let's address them before moving on. Can I use AAA without AAA servers? And the answer will be yes. We can rely on local databases. For instance, for authentication, we can use the command username to have our database. For authorization, we can configure privilege levels or RBAC views. And we must bear in mind that accounting will be limited if not using AAA servers. So can I use accounting locally? Yes, with limited features. For instance, we could use this command to create a registry each time a user executes a command and save it into the log. If accounting exec brings appropriate exec permissions, why do we really need accounting commands or accounting configure commands? Remember that these two features are mainly related to AAA servers. We want to provide AAA servers with the same level of control over what users can do as what we can do with privilege levels and RBAC views. Last question. How is it possible that the authorization exec feature may deny access to an exec session to a user if the user was previously authenticated successfully? The answer is this may happen due to a combination of events and settings. Let's place an example. Let's say that we configure authentication to use a local database. And let's say in this example that the user authenticated successfully. But at the same time, we configure authorization to use AAA servers. And in this example, let's say that these servers are not available. So in that case, the authorization will fail. So even though a user may authenticate successfully, there may be cases where the user may fail the authorization phase. And in that case, the user will not get access to an exec session and the connection will be terminated. Let's make a summary of what we have talked so far regarding AAA. We are going to illustrate this with this imaginary timeline that represents the user experience when trying to use an exec session. First of all, we are going to decide whether to grant this user access to the device. Then we are going to decide what is the sets of permissions that the user has in order to enter commands into this device. Optionally, we may register that an exec session started. Then we are going to validate that the enabled passwords that the user may enter are correct. Then optionally, we may go into detail and grant permissions to particular operational commands or configurational commands. And optionally, we may register that a user executed a command. And at the end, we are going to optionally maybe create a registry that the exec session is over. Now let's illustrate what commands do we need in order to enable each phase. For accounting, we will need to enter AAA commands in global configuration mode and in line configuration mode. The same for authorization exec, the same for accounting exec. Now for the enable feature, we only need to enter one command in global configuration mode. In order to grant permissions to execute operational commands, we will need to enter AAA commands in global configuration mode, in line configuration mode, per privilege level. And in order to grant permissions to execute configurational commands, we only need one AAA command entered in global configuration mode. For accounting commands, we are going to need AAA commands entered in global configuration mode, in line configuration mode, per privilege level. We are going to talk in details about these commands now. This is probably the most basic AAA configuration that we can come up with that includes authentication, authorization, and accounting without using AAA servers. Let's analyze it. Notice that we can divide this configuration in two parts: the commands that are entered in global configuration mode and the commands that are entered in line configuration mode. Notice that in global configuration mode, we are going to define something that we call method lists. We have not talked about method lists yet. We are going to talk about them more in detail later on. And notice also that we are going to use this method list in line configuration mode. So let's analyze these line by line. The first command is AAA new model. With this command, we are going to start up AAA altogether within this device. By issuing this command, we will gain access to all the other AAA features and commands. For authentication, we are going to create this method list that we are going to call default with the command AAA authentication login. With this feature, we can create one or many method lists, as many as we want. But in this case, we are only creating one method list. This method list includes one method that indicates that for authentication, we are going to rely on the local user database that we created previously with the command username. So we will be pulling usernames and passwords from this database in order to authenticate incoming users. Now, in order to validate enable passwords, we are going to create this method list that we are going to call default with the command AAA authentication enable. For this feature, we usually only create one method list. This method list only includes one method. In this case, this method indicates that we are going to rely on locally stored enable passwords. For instance, the ones created with enable secret or enable passwords commands. For the authorization exec feature, we are going to create this method list that we are going to call default, that we are going to create with the command AAA authorization exec. For this feature, we may create one or many method lists, as many as we want. In this case, we are only created one, and this particular method list only has one method. This method indicates that we are going to rely on the local user database that we created with the username command in order to grant exec permissions to users once they have been authenticated. Remember that when issuing the command username, you have to grant users a privilege level or an RBAC view. So that configuration is going to be taken into account in order to grant the necessary permissions to users. Now, what users can execute and configure depend on whatever privilege level or RBAC view that you assign to them. In order to perform accounting, we are going to use this command in order to at least create a registry each time a user executes a command. We are going to store this registry in the local log. Before continuing the explanation for our AAA basic configuration, let's talk a bit about how method lists are put in motion. Remember that in global configuration mode, we are only defining method lists. They are not being put in action yet. When a user, an application, or a script wants to gain access to our device, these entities are going to do so through our VTY or console lines through our HTTP server, for instance, for RESTconf, or through a secure shell session for netconf. So we are going to have to put this method list in action, actually in line configuration mode, when configuring our HTTP server or when tuning netconf. So for instance, for authentication, in line mode, we are going to use the command login authentication, and we are going to use a method list previously created in global configuration mode. And also for authentication, for our HTTP server, we are going to use this command, and we are going to use a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode. For authorization, in line configuration mode, we are going to use the command authorization exec and a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode. In the same manner, for our HTTP server, we're going to use this command and a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode. And when tuning netconf, we're going to use this command, AAA authorization, and a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode. The same applies for the authorization commands feature. In line configuration mode, we are going to use the authorization commands and a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode. And for HTTP, we are going to use this command and a method list that was previously created in global configuration mode as well. After explaining that, now we can understand this part of the configuration. For BTY lines from 0 to 15, we're going to perform login authentication using this method list that we created previously in global configuration mode. And for the authorization exec feature, we are going to use this method list that we created previously in global configuration mode. For the console, we are going to perform authentication using this method list that we created in global configuration mode as well. Just a note here, authorization is altogether disabled for the console by default, because we want to avoid the remote case where under some circumstances this feature may lock you out from your device. However, if you want to enable authorization for the console, you can use the command AAA authorization console. Let's take a break to talk about method lists. Method lists are heavily used by AAA features. Most of them have a default method list, and most of them let the user create named method lists. Let's take, for example, the AAA authentication login command that allows us to create one default method list and one or many named method lists. After defining this method list, we can apply them to lines. In this example, we are creating two method lists, both for the AAA authentication login feature. The first method list is going to be called default, and the second method list is going to be called for console. We are going to use this method list default, and we are going to apply it to lines BTY 0 to 15. And we are going to take this other method list and we are going to apply it only for the console. Remember that method lists are defined in global configuration mode and used in line configuration mode. So in this example, we are creating these two method lists for the same feature in global configuration mode, and we are going to use them in line configuration mode. Method lists are made of methods. In this example, the default method list has two methods, this method and this method. And the for console method list only contains one method. Methods within method lists are processed left to right. So for instance, this method list will have this method getting processed first. Let's see how method lists work. We are going to add methods to the method list by configuring them from left to right. And that is the way these methods will be processed, in the same manner, from left to right. In this example, we have three methods. Let's say that method 1 consists of asking permissions for a feature for a certain user to server number 1. And method 2 consists on asking for permissions for the same feature for the same user for server number 2. And method 3 consists on asking for permissions to a feature to the same user for server number 3. So the process will be the following. We are going to try method number 1. In this case, for this example, we are going to send a request for server number 1, and we are going to wait for a response. If we don't receive a response, we are going to try method number 2, that in this example consists on sending a request to server number 2 and waiting for a response. If we don't receive a response, we are going to try method 3. In this case, in this example, this means sending a request to server number 3 and waiting for a response. If we don't receive a response for the last method, we are going to reach the conclusion that we are going to deny permission for this feature for this user. Now, if at any point a method responded, in this example, a server responded, we are going to evaluate the response. If it is positive, we are going to grant permission to this feature to this user. Otherwise, we are going to deny permission for this feature for this user. So let's see some examples of methods that we can use in method list. For instance, most of the time when we see the local method, this means that we are going to consult a local database in the running config looking for approval for this feature. If we see the line method, this means that we are going to grant approval based on the line password. And for instance, if we see the method group and the group name, this means consulting a series of AAA servers looking for approval for a certain feature. And for instance, if we see known, this means approving this feature without consulting anything whatsoever. So if we use known, the outcome will be always a positive result. Let's take a step back and talk about these two terms. With device access control, we are going to provide controlled user access to devices. And with network access control, we are going to provide controlled devices access to a network. Now, the technology known as TACACS is better suited for device access control, and the technology known as Radius is better suited for network access control. Both technologies, TACACS and Radius, are AAA servers. For the time being, we are going to focus on device access control. We are going to compare TACACS Plus with Radius. TACACS is a technology that was originated by Cisco. It stands for Terminal Access Controller Access Control System. This is the format for the header. Notice that we have a type field here that we can set to authentication, authorization, or accounting. Now, Radius is an open standard that uses this header. Notice that we have a code field here that we can set to access request, access accept, access reject, access challenge, accounting request, accounting response, and disconnect request. Okay, let's keep comparing both solutions. TACACS was originally a full proprietary Cisco solution. However, it now has become an open standard. However, not many vendors are implementing it outside Cisco. And Radius is an IETF open standard. Now, Radius combines authentication and authorization, whereas TACACS clearly separates authentication from authorization from accounting. Now, TACACS can support individual command authorization, whereas Radius cannot. TACACS and Radius both support session accounting. TACACS support click command accounting, whereas Radius cannot. Now, regarding network access control, the recommended solution will be Radius, whereas for device access control, the recommended solution is TACACS. Regarding encryption, TACACS encrypts the whole payload, whereas Radius the password only. And this is a big thing. Radius supports EAP. That means it supports several authentication methods, whereas TACACS do not. And regarding ports numbers, TACACS uses TCP49, and regarding Radius, all Cisco devices will use 1645 and 1646, but the standard is actually establishes that the ports are 1812 and 1813. Let's move on and see how to add AAA servers to our AAA configuration. The first step will be actually configuring servers where we are going to add servers, and then we are going to create server groups. The same applies for Radius and for TACACS Plus. So for TACACS Plus, we can use this old command in order to create a server. Not recommended. We should use the new command, where we are going to assign a server name. Then we're going to enter into server mode, where we can configure an IP address and a key. AAA clients that want to use this server must know this key, and then we can create a TACACS Plus server group with this command. Something similar applies to Radius, where we are going to be able to create a server with this command. We are going to provide a server name, then we are going to enter into server configuration mode, where we can configure an IP address and a key, and then we can create a Radius server group with this command. This will be the examples of a more complex AAA configuration now that we are using AAA servers. So let's analyze it. We can still divide these in two parts: the global configuration mode commands and the line configuration mode commands. Remember that in global configuration mode, we are defining the method list, and in line configuration mode, we are using the method list. So all these method lists that we are configuring in line configuration mode must be previously defined in global configuration mode. The main difference is that within our method list, we're including these methods: group, and using a server group name. So this means that these features will go and ask this AAA server first, and if these servers do not provide a response, then the method list indicates that we are going to rely on local configuration. Also notice that once that we are using AAA servers, now we're using these two features: AAA authorization commands and AAA authorization config commands. With these commands, we are providing the servers with the same level of control that we have when we configure privilege levels locally. Notice also that we are using accounting commands now that we are using AAA servers. Now let's summarize the authentication commands that we have available in global configuration mode. For instance, we have AAA authentication login. This feature is based on list, supports named list, supports an unlimited amount of methods within each list. These are the methods that we have available for this feature. So for instance, we can authenticate based on the enable secret command with the enable method. We can authenticate with the line password using the line method. We can authenticate with the username and password with the local method. We can grant access always with the known method. We can consult Radius servers for authentication with the group Radius method. We can consult TACACS Plus servers for authentication with the group TACACS method, or we can consult a specific group with the group name methods. There are other methods that we are not talking here about, for instance, Kerberos 5 or ALDAP. Next feature, AAA authentication enable. This feature is based on list. It does not support named list. We can only create the default list. We may have an unlimited amount of methods within the default method list. We have these methods available for this feature. So we can validate enable passwords with the locally created enable secret password with the enable method, with the line password using the line method. We can always accept or grant or confirm or verify any password with the known method. We can query all Radius sources with the group Radius method. We can query all TACACS sources with the group TACACS Plus method. We can query a specific group with the group and group name methods. Other authentication features are, for instance, AAA authentication PPP, AAA authentication password prompt, AAA authentication suppress null name, or AAA authentication banner. Let's summarize the commands that we may enter in global configuration mode for authorization. First of all, we have AAA authorization EXEC, which is based on list, supports named list. We may enter up to 4 methods at each list. These are the methods that we have available: group and group name, if authenticated, local, and known. Next, we have AAA authorization command 0 to 15. This feature is based on list, supports named list. We have an unlimited amount of methods with each list. These are the methods that we can use: cache, group and the group name, if authenticated, local, and known. Remember that authorization is not enabled for the console by default, so if you want to enable authorization for the console, you can use AAA authorization console. Other authorization commands are AAA authorization auth proxy, AAA authorization network, and AAA authorization reverse access. Now let's summarize accounting commands. Remember that accounting commands are based on record types. We may have stop only record types, start and stop record types, and known record types. Stop only will create only one record type after a resource has been used. Start and stop record types create two entries, one once a resource begins being used and another after a resource has been used. None will not create any records whatsoever. So we have the AAA accounting exec feature that is based on list, supports named list. We may have an unlimited amount of methods within our list, and these are the available methods. For AAA accounting commands 0 to 15, this feature is based on list, support named list. We may have an unlimited amount of methods within each list. These are the methods available for this feature. Other accounting features are AAA accounting network, AAA accounting connections, AAA accounting system, AAA accounting resource, and AAA accounting BRRD.